announcements. Wonderful to have you all here. Also, hi, John Miller from SFI is also here. Roman, many places, Sabina, that we also recognize from other walks of life. Good to have you all with us and welcome. And as some of you know, in this series of short talks, we are exploring how we humans augment our intelligence, not only socially through collaborating with others, but also by different technological innovations and interactions with various machines. And so this is this broad topic of augmented intelligence, socially and technologically augmented intelligence. The workshop is organized by Rob Goldstone and Marina Dubova from Indiana University, Gautam Biswas from Vanderbilt, and myself. And today we have, each week we have two excellent speakers talking about different aspects of social and technological augmentations to intelligence. And today we have two distinguished speakers who are studying various aspects of how people interact with technology designed to help them solve various tasks. Our first speaker will be Cesar Hidalgo. He's the director of the Center for Collective Learning at the Artificial and Natural Intelligence Institute at the University of Toulouse, with also appointments at Manchester and Harvard. And he will be talking about how we humans perceive machines and how we make moral judgments about them. And this is a broad line of research that Cesar has been doing and leading for some time, and we're excited to hear this latest results and overview of how humans judge machines. And our next speaker, the second one, will be Cindy Hmelo-Silver. She is a distinguished professor of learning science, and she's also a Jacobs Chair in Education and Technology, and the director of the Center for Research on Learning and Technology at Indiana University. And she will talk about how technologies provide affordances that help people learn in complex contexts, both alone and in collaboration with others. And so taken together, these two speakers provide a perspective on how technologies that aim to augment our intelligence should be designed, among other things, how they should be designed to enable smoother interactions and more productive interactions, both between humans and machines and between humans who use these technologies and machines. And so before Cesar takes us on this journey, followed by Cindy, let me just note that this meeting is being recorded. It will be posted on the workshop YouTube channel, so behave yourself and make sure your microphone is turned off at all times, except when you're speaking. Feel free to post, in fact, we encourage you to post any meeting-related thoughts and questions in the chat window, and we will post this chat later on our Slack channel for posterity. And you're also welcome to post directly to Slack and send any related publications and so on. After each talk, we will take a couple of questions specific to the talk. And so just raise your hand or write your question in the chat, and I will moderate the discussion. And then in the last 20 minutes or so, we'll open up for broader discussions on questions that are related to both talks and augmented intelligence more generally. So thank you, Cesar and Cindy, for being with us. And Cesar, please take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, so let me share my screen. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you about a recent paper that we just put on the archive that tries to explain why people judge humans differently from the way that we judge machines. So to introduce the paper, I'm going to do a little bit of a recap of what we've done before that is going to help set up this question. So a few years ago, actually last year, we published a book called How Humans Judge Machines. And the book did more than 80 experiments in which we compared people's reactions to human and machine actions. So the book basically was based on a series of randomized controlled trials in which we would recruit groups of about 200 people that would be exposed to an experiment. Usually would be a mistake, but sometimes we had positive situations as well, in which either a machine or a human was seen performing an action, and we asked people to react, to that scenario. And people were randomly assigned to a treatment condition in which they saw that action as the action of a machine, or they saw that action as the action of a human. And we used those experiments to explore whether we judge humans and machines equally, and if not, what difference do we make? So the scenarios were things like this one. Here you have a tsunami that is approaching a town of 10,000 people. It has potentially devastating consequences. There's a politician or algorithm that is responsible for the safety of the town, and it can evacuate people with a 50% chance of success or save 50% of the town with 100% success. In this case, we have three possible outcomes: a lucky outcome in which everyone is safe, an unlucky outcome in which the rescue effort fails and a large number of people die, and the compromise scenario in which only 50% of people are saved. And we record people's answers, using a number of questions. Was this scenario harmful? Would you hire this politician or algorithm? Was the action perceived to be intentional? Do you like, the agent, the machine, or the human in this case? So when we look at the answers here, when we start from the right and we look at the compromise scenario, we don't see a lot of differences. Like here, red dots show the average answer obtained for the machine, and blue dots the average answer obtained for the human. And for the most part, when we take the compromise, when we say 50% of the people with no uncertainty, people judge the action as equally harmful. They judge liking the human and the machine the same, and so forth. The only big difference is when we ask people, would you replace the machine by a human or the human by a machine? People want to replace a machine by a human when that machine takes a compromise, even though they judge it similarly. When we have the lucky scenario, when we try to rescue everyone and succeed, people judge the human much better than the machine. This is a scenario in which people report liking the human more. They find the action to be more morally correct. They want to promote the human, and they also see the action to be actually much more intentional, as in this case. Now, when you try to save everyone and fail, we observe big differences. Here, the human is evaluated relatively positively. They want to hire it. They tend to like it. They find the action to be morally correct. But the machine is not judged so positively. They don't want to hire the machine. People don't like it that much. They don't find the action to be as morally correct. They see the action as more harmful, and so forth. So we start seeing that there are differences in the way that people judge humans and machines. And this last scenario helps us illustrate those differences. It is basically that the human in this case is being judged for trying, is being judged for their intention or motivation, while the machine is being judged for failing, for the outcome of the scenario. And that explains a lot of those differences. So what we do in the book is we look at a lot of scenarios, scenarios involving moral dimensions of purity, self-driving cars, human resources screening, automation, all of the ones that we could imagine. There's 89 scenarios in total. And at the end, we put them together using a mathematical framework that I call the moral functions, in which we try to predict the perception of wrongness that a person would assign to a scenario as a function of characteristics of the scenario and characteristics of the individuals that judge that scenario. So here, wrongness W is going to be a function of the perceived intention, the perceived harm, and fixed effects for the subject, so we can control for some people maybe being more judgy than others, or differences in judgment based on demographic characteristics. So this function, when we model it, we find that it's different for scenarios that were presented to our subjects as the actions of humans or machines. In red, you see this moral function characterizing the way that people judge scenarios involving machines. On blue, the one in which people judge scenarios involving humans. And you see that the blue plane has a bit of a curvature compared to the red plane. The red plane is relatively flat because what we find is that for the most part, when people are judging machines, they only care about the outcome. It's the perceived level of harm. It's not what the machine was trying to do, designed to do, or intending to do. It is about what happened. If there was an accident that resulted on physical harm, people are going to evaluate that scenario poorly, no matter if the machine was trying to avoid that physical harm in its action or not. But when they judge a human, which is the blue plane, we observe, this different shape. We observe that curvature on the blue plane. And actually what really matters is this diagonal, that is the interaction term between intention and harm. So when people are judging humans, we see a moral philosophy that is more motivated on intentions or motivations, and people are more willing to forgive a human that did something really bad if they really didn't mean it. So that's great. It tells us that it's not that we simply have a preference for humans over machines. We're using different moral philosophies, a moral philosophy that is more consequentialist when we judge machines, and one that is more motivated on intentions when we judge humans. But we wanted to ask, why? Is this just that there are these two different modes, or are these modes part of a continuum or a progression of moral judgments that we could try to map out? So what we did is, with Jane Conway, that is now at the University of Galway, and Jingling Zhang from my team, we decided to run a new series of experiments that tries to explain why people judge machines differently than humans, and whether people would judge machines that are more similar to humans, more similar to the way that we judge machines, okay? So is it that we judge them differently, or is there like a continuum of mental models in which just machines and humans are two different points on this larger space? So what we did is we set up a similar experiment, but instead of having one machine condition, we had 4 machine conditions, okay? And these machine conditions were designed to show different levels of agents and experience. So we choose a mind perception model in which entities, in this case, machine and humans, are classified according to their perceived level of agency and experience. Agency is this ability to do, to plan, to remember, to act, to strategize, and so forth. And experience meaning this ability to feel, this ability to feel sadness, pain, hunger, fear, and so forth. This has been studied before, not with multiple machine conditions. So what we decided is to grab, this framework that was presented in a paper by Gray et al. In Science in 2007, and use it to manipulate people's perception of machines to create a machine condition that was high agency, high experience, or high agency, low experience, and so forth. So we could do that. The way that we did this manipulation is by presenting people with a short description of the agent that was performing the action. In both cases, in the human and the machine condition, this agent was called Alice, and Alice was described as an advanced robot that was able to plan, or as an robot that was unable to plan and it was not advanced, or a robot that some scientists believe that, had an advanced artificial intelligence so she could feel, or it had a primitive artificial intelligence and was unable to feel. And we checked that the manipulation works. We recover, the statistics of people's perception of agency and experience using the questionnaire from Gray et al. And we actually find that the manipulation works. The human is perceived as having high levels of agency, high levels of experience, but we're able to create 4 machine conditions that are separate in terms of the perceived agency and experience. So now that we have, our data, and we collected the data using 9 scenarios, I'm not showing all of the scenarios because this is a short presentation, but they're similar to the ones that we saw before. We can use our modal functions. Now, in this case, we're going to have to introduce a little bit of nuance, because if you remember our modal functions, it was a function that tries to predict W, wrongness, as a function of harm and intention, but it has an interaction term, a term that multiplies intention and harm. And that interaction term is really important, because without that interaction term, this function cannot have any curvature. It would be just, a plane, and that interaction term gives a nonlinearity that provides a curvature. But also, because of that interaction term, the derivatives, which are what we really care about, are non-trivial, are not just the coefficients. So we care about how harm affects the perception of wrongness. So dw to dh, and that's b1 plus b3 times I, so the interaction term enters and the coefficient b3 enters. And we care about how intention affects the perception of wrongness, which is also this other function b2 plus b3 times h. So the derivatives are, we cannot just read the coefficients straight up. We're going to have to calculate these other quantities, after we look at the regression tables. So with that aside, we expand our model. We add interaction terms for agency and for experience. We group them, and we're able to get to the same reduced form, but now these coefficients b1, b2, b3 are actually coefficients that are composed of, an unconditional coefficient, a coefficient conditional on agency, and a coefficient conditional on experience. When we estimate the model, we find something interesting right away, which is that from those interaction terms, only the interaction terms that have an agency component seem to be robust, meaning that they work in the OLS, they work in the fixed effects model. So we keep only those robust coefficients, only the ones that have an interaction with agency, and we derive our modal functions. So we now have a modal function that helps predict wrongness, as a function of harm and intention for high agency and for low agency, because experience, remember, was not significant on the model, so we cannot justify having them on the function. And when we take our derivatives, we learn something quite interesting. So here is the derivative of wrongness on harm, the W to the H. And this is a function of intention because of that interaction term. The dotted line shows the median intention of the scenarios. So basically, most of our sample, the mass of our distribution, is towards the left of this chart. And at the left of this chart, where that dotted line hits the blue and the red line, we find that actually, when we look at machines that are perceived to have high agency, the WDH is smaller than for low agency machines, okay? So for most of our scenarios, that are concentrated on the left, when machines are perceived to have high agency, the effect of harm on wrongness is reduced in the moral judgment, yeah? That's similar to the way that we were judging humans, because when we judge humans, we don't care so much about the outcome, we care more about the intention. Now let's see the other derivative, the WDI. So the WDI here, shows a very clear case in which no matter, where you are along the harm dimension in the scenario, when you have a higher agency machine, a machine that is perceived to have higher agency, the role of intention on the way that is being judged is larger. So we find here again evidence that as the machine is perceived more similar to human in terms of agency, in terms of capacity, we judge it more similar to the way that we judge human. We start interpolating between these two moral philosophies, from the consequentialist philosophy to the philosophy that is based on intentions. And by using these moral functions, we can actually look at that interpolation. We can map this continuum. So here are the full planes now. On the left, you have the low agency condition, and you see that there the blue and the red plane do not overlap too much. They don't coincide. There's still kind of like a big difference, and intention seems to still be much more important on the blue plane than on the red plane, But when we move to the right, the planes start to overlap, meaning that across all the scenarios, the way in which we're judging machines and humans becomes more similar when we manipulate people to believe that these machines have higher levels of agency. We also look at the area between these surfaces, by calculating the integral between, the different surfaces. And we find that, of course, the one on the right has much smaller area, telling us that these judgments are more similar across, this phase space. So to conclude, we try to understand how humans judge machines. First, in the book, we learned that there were two different moral philosophies at play. People judge humans by intentions and machines by their outcomes. And also, I didn't show this, but that's in the book. People judge human intentions more bimodally. When we judge human intentions, we either blame people or forgive people, but we blame machines' intentions more unimodally, more in the middle. People tend to be more forgiving of humans in accidental situations. And we also, in the book, find evidence that people are a bit more judgy of humans in scenarios involving fairness, like algorithmic bias, labor displacement, and so forth. But what we did in the paper then was try to go a little bit deeper, try to ask the question, why do people judge humans and machines differently? And we found that these differences in moral philosophers seem to be part of a continuum. There's a progression of mental models. And as we move the machine along this space of mental models, we also get to move the way that people judge them. We get to move them to a mode of judgment that is more similar than the one that we use to judge humans. So machines that are perceived closer to humans or more similar to humans, based on this mental model of perceived agency and experience, tend to be judged more similarly than the way that we judge humans. And this would tell us that it's not that we just have different ways of judging humans as machines, but we have a continuum way of judging things depending on the mental models that we have about them. And machines and humans tend to occupy different parts of this space, but as we move one towards the other, we can move the judgment of machines similar to that of humans. And with that, I would like to thank you very much. If you're interested in the book, it's available at MIT Press. It's also available free online. There is also a collection of 30 YouTube videos that I created for online education, during the pandemic, that they can use to be watched before the class and then, discuss in class if you're interested in these topics. And the paper on how people judge humans different from machines and why is now up on the archive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I invite everyone to clap in whatever way you like. And I invite questions specific to this talk, if anyone has. And while you are, here you are. Susian, would you like to? Okay, you're just clapping. Okay, while you're finding your raise hand button, I wanted to ask whether is there any evidence on whether the collaboration between machines and humans is more successful if humans perceive these machines as kind of more similar, more morally to them, to humans?
Yeah, not evidence that I would have, but I do remember, at the Media Lab, Cynthia Brazil used to work a lot on that, and at least what she would find is that collaboration was more successful when machines were able to express emotional cues, so they would provide, robots with eyebrows and other things, and they would manipulate whether they would move those eyebrows in a social way or not, or they would just remain fixed, and it would help collaboration, because it will help reduce that stress that sometimes is caused for human-machine interaction. This would be a different type of experiment, using like real robots on a big space and performing tasks collaboratively with the actual machines. Yeah.
Thank you. Roma?
Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering whether or not you can provide any explanation based on your results of the algorithm aversion versus algorithm appreciation effects in decision making when we take into account advice from humans versus advice from artificial intelligence systems?
I don't think I would have a mechanistic model in mind, to explain that. Maybe you have one that you would want to suggest?
No, I was just interested because it looks like the studies just ask questions on whether or not we kind of like machines or don't like machines. And depending on the task, they get different results, like whether or not we rather listen to machines when making our decisions or listening for the similar advice from humans. So I was just thinking, what would be those cases where we could say that, okay, maybe in these scenarios, people would appreciate more advice from algorithms versus in these scenarios, they would be more likely to take into account advice from humans.
So I can say two things to that. The first one is, there's nice papers by Berkeley Ditborch from Chicago that they have looked at, algorithm aversion in the context of financial advice. And they find that actually, as algorithms become quote unquote more transparent, when people see the actions that algorithms make, the bad bets that they made on the market, people tend to trust them less, so that to me is interesting, because there is a lot of work on explainability that is motivated by the idea that people will trust machines more if they're more explainable, transparent, but we tend to overinterpret maybe our ability to do things differently from machines. So when we see them error, we tend to think, I wouldn't have put my money on FTX. Well, like last week, maybe you would have still, and the machine, it gets overinterpreted there. In our book, we find that even when people tend to judge machines positively compared to humans, in the question of whether they would replace the machine by a human, the machine always gets kicked out. So in the chapter, for instance, that we look at algorithmic bias, we do a lot of scenarios on human resources, college admissions, policing, and so forth. And we find that in some of those cases, actually, people tend to judge machines a little bit better than they would judge humans, because a human that is biased, a human that is seen doing something discriminatory, is considered to be doing something intentional and therefore somehow evil. They're trying to do something wrong. The machine gets a little bit forgiven, not a lot, but a little bit forgiven for that. But still, when we compare a good machine, a machine that was presented to humans as having corrected an unfair situation, and a bad human, a human that was seen to be done something unfair, people want to replace the good machine with a human more than they would like to replace the bad human with a machine. So in our sample, there was a strong aversion, even when the evaluative dimensions would change. That question of whether you would replace the machine by a human was a question in which machines were always pushed down a lot, even when they were good and the human was bad.
I see. Thank you.
Amazing. Rob?
Great, thanks for a really fun talk, Cesar. So it just occurs to me that like ascribing intentions is quite assumptive, And if you didn't know more, you would just say, I'm just going to go on the basis of the behavior. And it might be that like people kind of are more comfortable ascribing intentions to other people because they empathize with them. They're comfortable making this sort of generalization from what's in their mind to what's in other people's mind. So I'm just wondering how much of this is due to just not being sure what to make of these computers and being conservative and not empathizing.
No, that's a good point. You know, like the way that we describe this on the book and on other presentations that are longer, is that we see intention a bit of as a continuum. So we don't see it as something that you either have or not. You know, like between a rock and a human, you're gonna have different levels of intention when you go into like a dog or when you go to a machine, depending on the capabilities that the machine has. You know, and I like to separate intention, you know, in two. The intention that comes from your agency in your ability to pursue a goal, and the agency that comes on defining goals. You know, you have both. You are basically almost at a human level of intention. You're defining goals and you're executing them. But if you're only executing goals that are given to you, you have kind of like a lower level of intention that still is there because there might be multiple ways to satisfy the goal. And we believe that people perceive machines to be more towards that lower level. And that also might explain why, you know, we observe the way that people perceive human intentions to be more bimodal and machines' intention to stay bounded in that middle layer. You know, now when we estimate the functions technically are interpolated across the whole range of values. You know, so I think what you have is a valid concern and question. You know, and I would just have to think quantitatively how I would be able to do that treatment. You know, compared to cases in which there are cases in which humans still are seen to have intention in those same ranges as machines. So I will have to think about an experiment or a quantitative method that would help me connect the variance of the observed intention to the curvature of the planes that we observe. Yeah, and if that is what is played, I think it's a good question, and I don't think I have a straight answer. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
So I wanted to react to the connection of the previous question with the literature on algorithm aversion and preference. So I think it's important to differentiate between the question of comparing machines and humans when they make decisions, as in the current talk, and when they offer advice, because often when they offer advice, the outcome is unknown. And I think that one explanation between some of the paper that found algorithm aversions and others that find algorithm appreciation is that in the latter, they have no access to the outcome. And I think that this current talk that kind of points out how important outcome is in judging algorithms clarifies that. My second comment is that even in context of advice, even when people express preference for one source, typically for humans over machines, when they actually need to make choices and take actions based on the two, they seem to treat both of them equally. So people say, yes, we prefer humans, but that doesn't mean that they are going to ignore or disregard advice from algorithms. We've just published a paper in the Journal of Behavioral Decision Making with a series of experiments showing that there's no correlation between stated preference from a source and willingness to act according to advice from the two.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Yeah, it's fascinating. There are a couple of other questions in the notes in the chat. The project actually had a good question that stemmed from his missing the first 10 minutes of talk, but it's an interesting question. Do you want to ask it? Why do humans happen to judge machines in the first place? What would you say to that, Cesar?
Sorry, I was trying to read the questions in the chat. Can you repeat that? So,
project, maybe you want to ask question yourself, actually. Not sure if I see him. Basically, he asks, why do humans happen to judge machines in the first place? Do humans, is this because of human general tendency to anthropomorphize things around us?
Well, yeah, I do think we're a very judgy species for better or for worse, you know, and that's particularly what motivated my research on this topic in the first place, because I remember in 2016, 2017, as artificial intelligence was becoming hotter and hotter as a topic, when you read about it on popular media, when you read about on social media and so forth, there would be kind of a lot of judgment that was going on. Of course, there might be a few things, maybe it was about the technology, maybe it was America becoming more moralizing in its speech more generally, but I could see that it was definitely, a moralizing take that people were taking on the technology and on the machines. And what I wanted to do with this research was try to take a step back and try to see, well, are those judgments, judgments that we're making about the actions, or are these judgments that are biased based on who's performing the action? I'm a big believer that you should judge an action, not who's performing the action. And I was not clear if we were judging machines or technology harsher, than we would judge a human that would do the same, and I think that's really important when you have technology on critical components. For instance, we all know that there's technology has been used for advanced parole systems, and that technology is far from perfect and is biased, but the benchmark must be the humans that are performing that task, not an idealized perfection, because otherwise it's hard to make progress if you don't take that differential approach, to progress. So those were the ideas that motivated me to do this, because I saw people passing judgment on machines. I don't know maybe what's the psychological mechanism, I'm not a psychologist, of why people would react like that. Maybe it's because we're anthropomorphized, or but I did see it as a widespread phenomenon.
Right, and it's also long, as David was mentioning, it's a topic that has been researched for a long time in terms of how people judge advice from algorithms and from machines. And now we are having more and more machines that are actually doing things, so not just providing advice, but actually doing things instead of us, which then potentially is this problem. Okay, maybe Aaron, if you could make your question real short, we could, and if you want to ask it yourself.
Yeah, sure. So just if we were to compare humans and AI in the sense where if there was an annotation task and then human disagreements could be measured, the same way human AI measurements could be measured, and can we actually prove if the disagreement is pretty similar in terms of this measurement, then humans and AI kind of are very similar in a particular task?
I think that's an interesting suggestion. Of course, as an empiricist, we will have to run it, but I see that there might be an interesting experiment ahead, thinking about annotations and agreements between human machine, machine, and so forth. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We are right on time to start with our second talk. So Cindy, if you would like to take us away.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. Desktop too. Yeah. And I'm assuming you can see my slides and not my speaker notes now.
Yes.
Okay, just because now I can't see anything except my slides. So thank you all for being here. I want to talk about affordances of technology for ambitious learning practices, and just from the very start, thanks to some of my thought partners on some of the work I'm going to talk about, Krista Glazewski, Joshua Danish at Indiana University, and my colleague Hae-San Jeong at Hallym University in Korea. Quick overview. I'm going to do a conceptual talk, trying to pull together a couple of lines of thinking that I've been doing over the last many years to talk about affordances of technology for supporting computer-supported collaborative learning, some work thinking about ambitious learning practices that grows out of my work in problem-based learning, and then an example of a collaborative learning environment, crystalline Crystal Islands Eco Journeys that I've been working on for the last few years. But let me start with talking about computer-supported collaborative learning. And I just need to move my Zoom bar out of my way so I can see what I'm looking at. The late Naomi Miyake talked about computer-supported collaborative learning as research that focuses on learning as a cognitive and/or social process and studies learning designs, learning processes, and pedagogic practices that support technology-mediated coordination, communication, and collaborative processes in communities of learners. And this really points to the complex learning environments of CSCL for short. So Hae-San Jiang and I spent more time than I would probably like to think about, or perhaps really do like thinking about, doing a literature synthesis on computer-supported collaborative learning and trying to understand what are the kinds of functions or affordances. So what kinds of potentials, opportunities for actions do technology provide for computer-supported collaborative learning? And as we were trying to publish this was published in Educational Psychologist, we needed to have long discussions with the journal editors to convince them that this was the right way to think about it, that it wasn't just the software functions, but both the compound resources that different software tools provides and the kinds of learning that are possible, along with thinking about affordances as opportunities, but they're not guaranteed. So our ongoing effort on this was trying to think about what are some of the appropriate combinations, these functions for different pedagogical designs, and what's the interaction among them. And it was important for us, at least, in understanding how specific digital technologies and pedagogies could be productively used to support collaborative meaning making in ways that support agency, which gets to the notion of ambitious learning practices. So I'm going to fit these together in talking about them. We thought about establishing a joint task, providing communication channels, sharing resources, support for productive processes, co-construction, monitoring and regulation, as well as finding and building groups and community. I'm going to talk mostly about the first 6 of these. So one of the things that it seems really clear is that people actually need something to talk about, that good tasks provide opportunities for meaningful engagement with problems and issues that are relevant in a broader world. And it's often using collaboration around computers. This picture is an example from my own work with Catherine Eberbach, where students were working in a net logo simulation, and just the conversations as they're trying to figure out what the different entities in the simulation are led to productive discussions and engagement in inquiry tasks. Another important function is communication that allows collaboration across time and space. Emails, discussion boards, chat, video conferencing can provide either asynchronous or synchronous communication supports, each of which having their own advantage, but allowing people to interact in ways that are both appropriate and convenience, where here the technology also serves as a conduit. The example I have here is from Jerry Stahl's virtual math teams, where there's a synchronous chat, but they've also got tools for people to be able to reference what's in the representations. When we were first talking about this, facilitating sharing and creation of resources was a lot harder. During collaboration, people often need to have ways to just share things that can't be easily expressed through communication channels. So sharing videos or other resources that are relevant to current task or discussion. These might be reports, they might be images, they might be video, they might be tools. And it can be done with most of the communication technologies that are around now. When I was looking over some of my notes, I said, oh, we're not using some of these anymore. But, there are programs that like YouTube as the way of sharing videos, I think we're using cloud services in ways that even a few years ago we were not using, in ways that let us pool resources. Another important function that we'd like technology to provide, help address the challenges in both learning and collaboration. So learning materials might be difficult for the students. They might not know how to resolve conflicts when disagreements arise. We'd like to get all learners actively participating. And so scaffolds and support are important for that. So even when students do participate, trying to make sure they engage in productive interaction that supports deep processing of information, reflection, keeping them on task, or helping them resolve conflicts. So to help learners deal with their learning more effectively, different strategies and scaffolds, such as fixed scaffolds like scripts, providing different constraints in interfaces themselves. Adaptive scaffolds can come in the form of agents or guides. And as Sadhna Punta-Baker talked about, scaffolding as distributed, where you think about synergies among the fixed scaffolds that are pre-planned, as well as both adaptive scaffolds in software, but also I think the most important adaptive scaffold that we have, which is the teacher in a classroom. So in our work, we think the role of the teacher is always really important. Another place is beyond sharing resources and providing support, is also providing a way for people to build something new together and to engage in this sort of intersubjective meaning making, which is often considered the holy grail of CSCL. It's a place for people to share current understanding, understand what others think, and work towards a common goal. So the examples I'm showing here are Knowledge Forum, which was designed explicitly for collective advancement of knowledge, very generally, originally Scartamalia and Bereiter. This is from a paper from Carol Chan and Jan van Alst. And then in some current work that I'm doing with Joshua Danish now, the model and evidence mapping environment, where students are able to work collaboratively to jointly build a model, as well as have opportunities to critique and respond to critiques on their models. So again, it's a place for co-construction of knowledge. Another challenge in collaborative learning is that regulatory processes need to be shared and coordinated among group members. Oops. They need to monitor and regulate their own learning process, self-regulation, their group's progress in learning activities, co-regulation, and their shared regulation towards learning and inquiry processes. And finally, forming groups and communities. One of the unspoken challenges of collaborative learning is finding suitable collaborators. Having the right people to work with can change the outcomes of collaboration considerably. In classrooms, this is often done by the educators, but in more informal environments, these are emergent. And again, Ulrika Kress has done some lovely work on collaboration in Wikipedia. What I want to move to talking about is ambitious learning practices. But let me first think about some of the goals of education and why these kinds of learning practices feel really important to think about. In this quote from Barron and Darling-Hammond, they talk about education today that needs to focus on helping students learn how to learn so that they can manage the demands of changing information technologies, jobs, and social conditions. So not just learning about content, but also being able to think more broadly about evaluating information, about using technologies, about being able to learn more about the content they already knew. So I'm going to start with a few definitions of ambitious learning practices, by which we mean learning environments that are student-centered, collaborative, and require extended engagement with meaningful problems or questions. So the the work with the simulations that I showed earlier and the modeling and evidence mapping environment are both places where students worked for several weeks on a task. And there are also places where we hope we can promote collaborative disciplinary engagement that goes beyond individual conceptions of engagement to consider engagement as collaborative and multidimensional, goes beyond time on task and considers the collaborative interactions, the socio-emotional climate, metacognitive engagement, as well as how deeply learners are participating in disciplinary practices and working with disciplinary concepts as tool for their problem solving and inquiry. These ambitious learning practices refer to the class of inquiry-based learning methods that engage learners in collaborative problem solving and reflect authenticity in the discipline. So these include case-based learning, problem-based learning, project-based learning, narrative-centered learning environments. So a set of environments where the task may be ill-structured or at least less well-structured, and requires the learners to engage in collaborative investigation of some sort. To make sure that we can design tasks, because if you remember just a few minutes ago, one of the affordances that I talked about was having a joint task that was meaningful for learners. And so we use participatory co-design to help ensure personal, local, and cultural relevance and a sense of belonging to get input and feedback on our designs. Oops. Things are going backwards. Okay. One of the challenges of doing this work is providing the balance between learner agency and providing appropriate structure and support. So giving students the authority to solve problems. And we think of agency at both a group and individual level in terms of how learners can assume ownership of and make choices about their own learning and learning pathways. In our current work, we've been looking at ways that artificial intelligence can help foster meaningful collaboration, engagement, and learning. So taking advantage of productive and generative qualities of artificial intelligence that can involve providing adaptive support for collaboration, providing feedback for students engaged in complex tasks, as well as providing support for teachers by reducing the cognitive load as they orchestrate student learning, as well as there's future capabilities that we're just beginning to imagine. The generative capabilities of AI should also offer possibilities for creating and adapting meaningful contexts to adapt to particular populations, contexts, and interests. There's an interplay of facilitator and learner practices along with AI resources. This is the distributed scaffolding notion that I talked about earlier that might occur across fixed scaffolds that are set up in advance in the tools or other supports, as well as just-in-time support that the teachers provide. So the structuring of the problem and ways that learning is problematized, but also thinking about how do we transfer more of the responsibility to the learners. So thinking about what support can we provide directly to the student? How can we help the teacher provide support? We also think about how do we reduce the orchestration load? These environments are complex. They have a lot of moving parts. And so we want to think about how to help educators manage things at learning at the individual, group, and class levels. How we can leverage multimodal learning analytics in ways that are actionable for teachers, and how we can provide guidance and assistance to educators. And I am going to move from this to providing an example of Crystal Island Eco Journeys. It's a collaboration with North Carolina State University, funded by the National Science Foundation. work that's we will also be continuing as part of our work, the Engage AI Institute, NSF supported AI Institute for Engaged Learning. So in Crystal Island Eco Journeys, we have a scenario where students are on a field trip to an island in the Philippines, and where tilapia farming is important for the economy, and the fish are getting sick and they're asked for help. I was trying to fit this conjecture map onto a slide. I'm hoping that you can read some of it. Some of what I wanted to do with this is talk a little bit about a tool for design-based research, where we use theory to guide our design, where, let's see if I can make my pointer work, where, oops, this is what I was afraid of, where I can call out what some of these affordances are and show some examples. So this is, again, we have the fish farms, and this helped us in making decisions. The meaningful joint task was set up as an immersive game with problems of dying fish caused by cyanobacteria. We have a text chat, because even though kids are mostly working face-to-face, we made decisions about using an online communication space to help make students' thinking visible and amenable to learning analytics. We were also quite aware that productive collaboration doesn't happen without support, so we used a jigsaw participation instruction structure where different students in the group got different information. We had some fixed individual scaffolds in a notebook to support student information gathering, fixed collaborative scaffolds, and I will show you some of these in the DUCE app to help support disciplinary standards, including being able to understand tables and graphs. We had fixed collaborative scaffolding as part of our tied inquiry cycle to support collaboration, and we have some adaptive support. The mediating processes are what we would hope to see if things are working the way that we anticipate. We have our tied board as a co-construction space and support for teacher orchestration as part of our distributed scaffolding system. Right now, we're providing a dashboard for teachers, and they're able to see the chat activity. We're expecting to have some more complex orchestration assistance soon. So again, establishing the joint task, we've got an immersive game where students wind up on the island, they see some green slime. The scientists ask them for help. We had done focus groups. We found out the kids really wanted to be kids. We have some fixed scaffolding where students input individual answers to interpreting some of the data that they've collected. And the scaffolds are based on the accuracy of answers and their level of agreement. When they're finished, they get an update about that. They also, one of the individuals in the group will be asked to write an explanation, and the other students need to agree or disagree. In the tied board, the students identify some explanations and try to look at what of the data they've collected supports or doesn't support that. The system checks for whether students pulled their notes in the right spaces, and that they were consistent or not. And then a non-player character asks students to return to the tied board if their solutions are not correct, and encourages them to use sentence starters. We have sentence starters that are based on the accountable talk framework. And here's some adaptive scaffolding that we've developed based on, a lot of this is based on participation. And the students also fill out a short survey on collaborative sentiment, and they will get different feedback based on that. So again, together, these form part of a system of distributive scaffolding, and the important role of the teacher. Again, I don't have time to show the example of the teacher dashboard that we're piloting now. We've also just finished our implementation of fixed and adaptive scaffolding in 2 states. So stay tuned for data analysis. And I would like to thank our awesome team of collaborators, of my colleagues on the Eco Journeys project, and postdocs and graduate students, as well as our colleagues from North Carolina State. And if you would like to find more information about EcoJourneys, we've got the web link up there. And with that, I am done.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Everyone can clap in the way you like. Thank you. I invite questions related to the talk. And again, while you are finding your hand button, I wanted to ask 2 clarification questions because
Okay.
it's not my area. And so I was wondering, could you provide a few more examples of these ambitious learning practices or the context? Like what are those? What are some other examples of such tasks that one would collaborate over weeks and that you would study? And the other question is if you could provide a little bit more detail or examples of fixed and adaptive scaffolds, because that's interesting. I was wondering how they're fixed, how they're adaptive. Thanks.
Sure. So a lot of my background is in problem-based learning, which started in medical schools. No technology at all for the most part, that students get a problem about a patient and they have a task of explaining the patient problem. Depending on where you go, you may have a big book of possible patient data. Other places they're smaller. I would imagine now some of this is probably built into technology. So that's one example. Another is project-based science that comes out of the folks at Michigan State, where students have to answer a driving question like how healthy is the water in my local river? And students will go and collect data and try to come up with both an answer to the question, but also engaging in the appropriate science reasoning. In our example with MEME, the scaffolding explanations in epistemic development in systems, we have kids work on a problem of, it's also a fish death problem that you may see that as a theme in my work. It just turns out to be a fairly good context for science learning. The students will initially do some model building. They'll do some initial conjectures. The way we've set that up is they've got different evidence resources that they have to evaluate and try and put together a model based on those. It builds from Clark Chin and Ravit Duncan's work on praxis that's designed to teach kids about reasoning from evidence and argumentation and modeling. So does that help?
Thank
I
you.
can go on.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Are there any other talk-specific questions? Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. That was great. So I guess I'm interested in the idea of co-constructing knowledge and how much of it should be based upon like a given classroom and the students riffing off of each other right then and there versus a kind of a more longitudinal way of co-constructing, across different classrooms or across time, so that like one generation of students could take advantage of what other generations are doing, and I can see both costs and benefits for both of those. So I'm just kind of interested in the design choice.
So I think some of our work has been proof of concept. I would actually love to be able to have enough material to be able to go across a whole year, but other folks have done some of what you've asked. So the Knowledge Forum crew led by Marlene Scartamalia and Carl Bereiter, and I think some work by Nancy Law in Hong Kong, has done work where they've connected kids in Hong Kong and kids in Canada on building Knowledge Forum. Jim Slaughter's community of inquiry work actually has kids. I'm trying to remember if it's a wiki or some other. I think it's more structured than a Google Doc, but in the communities of inquiry, they have students build knowledge resources that they continue to, that subsequent generations of students continue to do. I think he's working with high school students. I think one of the things we've found interesting when we have students critique other groups. So we have students in the SEEDS project working with MEAN, we have students critique, first build their own model, and then they go and provide critiques for other groups. And trying to, so some students will have really good discussions about what to critique, but not actually write them down. And other groups, so I think having one of our next steps is trying to help students think about both how to critique and how to respond to critiques, as opposed to, you know, which ones to take seriously, which ones to dismiss, and how to provide principled arguments. But I could see examples for each. I think for us, some of it is thinking about, you know, how much we can do in a classroom. I mean, practical stuff.
Thank you. And Roman, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, what are your expectations about transferability of knowledge and skills that kids gain within this framework? I just know that in many cases, you can master the particular game and particular technological environment, but at the same time being unable to transfer it like to relatively similar kind of activities. And the second question would be, is there a way to evaluate kind of agency of kids within this? I mean, in participating in this kind of games, I know that sometimes when you make fun activity like obligatory, when you don't provide choices whether or not you can escape playing this game, it can result in some I know, maybe negative emotional reactions. I was just wondering, is there a way to evaluate those two things?
Okay, let me hit one at a time. So before I forget them. So the first was transferability, and I think one of the issue, and I agree that that's important. So in the work I did with the systems and cycles work, where we had kids learning about aquatic ecosystems, we actually had them work for about 6 weeks with 3 different ecosystems. And we provided transfer tasks to a land-based ecosystem and found positive effects there. And I think trying to come up with good transfer tasks, though I'm skeptical about, you know, how far you should even expect to get. But I also think you need these things to last long enough and over enough different situations. So in Eco Journeys, our goal is actually to provide support for collaboration, but we're doing 1 unit. It's relatively short. I hope we can help them collaborate better while they're in the game. I hope we can eventually figure out how to take these techniques to a broader variety of tasks. But do I think we're going to get any transfer of collaboration skills to tasks beyond that? No, not in a 1 week unit. So I think that's a goal, but it also means that we have to think about how do we take this across just 1 unit, provide enough opportunities for students to reflect. And in the 2 classrooms we were in this semester, even, you know, there were differences in how much the teachers talked about the ideas behind accountable talk, which has some principles for supporting high quality conversations. The second question was agency. I don't think we've got a good measure of it, but what I would like to think is that the work on collaborative disciplinary engagement might be a route to getting there. So on work with Tony Brogat and Britta Chang, we've been doing observational work using video to look at the extent at which students are engaged with both disciplinary ideas and practices. And so along with their engagement in collaboration and socio-emotional and trying to look at those together. And to the extent that students get really deeply engaged in that disciplinary learning might be a marker of agency. I'm a little tentative about saying that for sure, but I think it's a really good question and one we need to think more about. But I think the disciplinary engagement might be the first route towards that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from Aaron, and then we can just discuss a little bit more broadly. Cesar has to leave or had to go, but we can discuss more broadly about how this all relates to our interest in augmented intelligence. But Aaron, would you like to ask your questions? You have a couple.
Oh yeah, it's just a clarification. Like, so I wasn't I mean, it wasn't clear to me like how it introduces the peer discussion and the scaffolding in the game, in the context of the game. Like that's just something I was going to ask. And then the other one was a comment in follow-up to the discussion before, like about social transferability. Would be interesting to see, like, and like whether it gets worse or better if people were working individually on a game versus when they were collaborating.
So in Crystal Island, the peer discussions are introduced at 2 specific points in the game. So after each quest, the game is divided into 3 quests, and they have to both interpret data and they have to do joint data interpretation and joint explanation activity using the information they've gathered individually. And they've got a chat where they can negotiate. The kids also negotiate out loud because they're sitting near each other in the classroom. And so that's where the peer discussions are introduced. The fixed scaffolding is generally introduced in terms of the way that we structure the environment. So that was question 1.
The second is not a question, it's just like a comment.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I don't think we've looked at transfer from individual to group, because the individual piece, the kids are collecting information by themselves. So this way, when they come together, they all have different pieces that they can bring. Yeah, so I think they generally, it hasn't been an issue having them go through those. I'm hoping that there will be more branching in future versions of the game that might allow us to answer those questions better.
Thank you. Okay, opening the floor without Cesar, but kind of more general questions. What does this all mean? And if I could just start it off as a kind of being as a psychologist doing experiment, what would you say is the role of individual difference in how students interact with these technologies? Do you study that? What does it, what are some maybe individual characteristics that that affect how well students interact with these technologies, how much they like them, how much they would like to replace them with a human teacher, and so on?
So we have not generally focused on that. I'm just trying to think back to data from earlier work in Eco Journeys. Again, we had 2 years of not really being able to collect much data. So, but in our work with systems and cycles, where we did the work with the simulations and modeling tools for kids learning about aquatic ecosystems, we found similar learning games for kids that started with both low prior knowledge and high prior knowledge. One of the things that surprised us was that in one of the schools we're in, they had a fairly high proportion of students classified as special ed. We don't have any information about what the classifications were, but again, they started out lower than the kids who were not classified, didn't have those classifications, but the slopes of their gains were the same. And we did these measures not just with pre and post test, but we had kids do drawing tasks like 4 times over the course of the 5 weeks or so. So we tried to adapt Clark Chin's work on classroom microgenetic methods to look at that. We haven't done that in our current Eco Journeys work, and I don't think we've done it in the SEEDS work. And again, we've had to make adaptations over the last 2 years because of data collection.
So Cesar was one of his interesting questions was how likely would be humans to replace a human with a machine or machine with a human decision maker. Do you have any idea how much actually students like to work with technologies as opposed to real teachers or peers that would do the same, that would provide the same functions?
So the teachers are part of the system. I mean, the kids, we know the kids enjoy working with the technology. We don't know if it's because it's a novelty. We come in for a week or 2 weeks, at least with Eco Journeys, and the kids generally seem engaged and they're working with each other. And sometimes they get very excited and talk a lot instead of chatting, which makes it harder for us to detect what's going on in the talk. We're hoping that some of the AI Institute work will let us capture that data better. I think there are some kids who don't want to work with other kids.
And they prefer to work with technologies, or
no, they prefer to work with technologies and by themselves.
Okay.
But that's and the teacher's role is really important in their monitoring that the kids are all getting along okay, that they're engaging in learning tasks, that they're looking at what the progress is, that they're stopping for whole class discussions. So I don't think we've designed any of our tools to be used without a teacher there.
Okay.
We know, like in systems and cycles with the simulations, the kids would keep working with those way past. We would tell them, you need to run this 3 times to see what you're finding out, and the kids would, go through it much more than that. There's also group variability, and that always seems pretty persistent, that groups that work well together, that are pretty well engaged, that are supporting each other, tend to be pretty consistent. And groups that don't work well together or are not motivated, we tend to see that be consistent too.
You mean consistent in a sense that groups that worked together before they engaged with technology also worked well with technology, or?
No, in our studies. So it's almost like there's reliable group individual differences.
Okay.
At least for the duration of our studies.
And is it possible to predict or to explain why are some groups better?
So early on, when Sharon Derry and I were doing problem-based learning work with undergraduate ed psych classes, I think I tried every which way to make predictions, whether it was on data about people's strengths and weaknesses and learning strategies. The most reliable thing at that point was having a more mature student who would kind of serve as a soft leader in the group, if they took that responsibility on, which didn't always happen. And I think we haven't looked at that with the younger kids to see if that would be a predictor.
How, which brings me to also the age differences. So how old do the kids need to be to first start engaging with these kinds of technologies that you're studying?
So I always say I'm scared of kids below 4th grade. But I think that in the youngest I've worked with has been 4th and 5th graders. My colleague Joshua Danish, who's doing all this embodied modeling work, works with 1st and 2nd graders. Like I said, I'm scared below 4th grade.
Okay. I have more questions, but just wanted to ask if anyone else wants to jump in. Okay. Rob, would you like to?
So I guess I'm kind of interested. I had a similar question to Roman's question about transfer from these game-like environments. And I guess just to put my sort of deep worry, I guess, for some of these systems is that there might be like a trade-off between how much people engage in the specifics of the game and live in the game world versus how much they get transportable knowledge that they take to other situations. And I see your solution as somewhat intermediate, that it's clear when they're playing the game that there's knowledge that they're doing that is clearly applicable to the world and isn't in the game. But like I could see, like when people get like really into chess, they take chess seriously and they're not interested in transfer of that knowledge. They're just interested in playing chess any way they can, as well as they can. So I'm just wondering whether maybe I just have to jaundiced a view of cognition, or I'm just interested in your reaction.
So I don't think kids are ever going to spend a career becoming eco-journeys experts. Right? It's kind of a one-off. I mean, I would like to think that we would eventually build up enough where it could be a starter for a bunch of curriculum units. And I could imagine this as something to start off a curriculum unit. We do pre and post tests that get at next generation science standards. So we look at disciplinary core ideas and practices. And at least for our study that we did last spring, where we were finally able to collect data, but it was the last 2 weeks of this semester. So I always put a caution there because, and we found gains in particular on the items related to disciplinary practices. So the ones that were related to interpreting graphs and charts, which might be what you expect given what goes on in the Deduce and the Tideboard apps. So we see the learning gains that are driven by the places that they engage in the game. So, and those are outside of the game. So we see some of that. It's not so for us, it's not a game with multiple levels where, as I said, they can't become eco-journeys expert, but I could definitely see that. I think we need to, I think right now it's a proof of concept on supporting collaboration. And looking at the extent to which kids build on each other's ideas based on these supports. And that's data analysis that's still underway. One of my students has been looking at both the level of activity and evenness of participation, and trying to look at how that relates to achievement. And certainly finding that patterns where there's overall high activity, as nobody will be surprised by, that students are having higher gains, but also an interesting finding that we were just starting to stumble on is that students who were most in groups where the students who were most active seemed to rotate across the different quests also did well. So where there's evidence of turn taking, because in that spring data collection, we had video from the teacher, but not on all the groups. So we're trying to see what we can make sense of out of the in-game trace data. But I share your concerns about transfer and trying to figure out how far. But I also think it's how long they engage to, you know, do they get a bunch of different contexts?
Thank you. Okay, so perhaps to kind of come closer to kind of wrapping up. Oh no, is there another? I have a kind of more outward, forward-looking question. I was wondering, with all your work is fantastic and all the experience you have, what do you see as the biggest unresolved problems in your field in developing further these educational technologies and also implementing them more in the school practice? So if you could, solve two problems, what do you think is the most glaring, some kind of obvious deficiency? There's something that we still don't know, or maybe it's a practical thing of how these things can be implemented in school settings.
So I think figuring out how to both do enough where we can have these learning contexts that are meaningful to kids in a whole range of different environments. So rural kids and urban kids in Indiana versus urban kids in New York City. I mean, you've got a lot of different populations, and trying to be able to create relevance and that meaningful task. I think that's actually a big challenge. I think another is being able to make these manageable for real classrooms, by thinking about what are these systems of scaffolds. So how do we help teachers manage a classroom with lots of moving parts? What tools do we give them? What tools can we give? What can we do directly for kids? And what are the tools that we can give teachers so that they can do what they do best? And I think that's not just giving them information, because information is overwhelming, but being able to provide that in ways that either provide advice that they can use or not. But I think in the learning sciences, for the most part, we do a lot of proof of concept work. And I include myself in this. I love my ivory tower. But thinking about how do we take this on a broader scale. And I think one of the challenges of that is it's not just technical, it's also a people challenge. So like I might be good at thinking about how do we build some of these things, but really I'm not the person to do a big scale study. And I think thinking about how do we broker the collaborations that allow technologies to move from proof of concept to small quasi-experimental studies, and those might be some of the same people. I can do those. But then when you start thinking about what does it mean to try and work with a whole school district, and to hit a point where you want to do the kinds of mixed methods studies that both let you look at efficacy, but also let you answer the question of, under under what circumstances is something effective and what does it mean for it to be effective? So I think being able to answer those questions requires teams of people. And so I think there's technology challenges for sure. And I think AI can help with some of those. I'm really optimistic that the Engage AI Institute is going to let us do some of the things I've been thinking about. And I think other people have been thinking about for a long time. But I think there's also this social capital and ways that people get connected to figure out how do you move studies from the tiny, let's figure out what, our theory-driven proof of concept design-based research to being able to move to bigger scales. A long-winded answer to that, maybe.
No, that's great. And we have some speakers who are doing this large scale studies, and maybe some connection between those and these kind of educational technologies could be useful. Although, as you said, you're not so much interested in the general public experiments. You need to work with the whole school district. So you're working with children, which are special demanding population and difficult to get. But yeah, no, thank you very much. It was very insightful. We learned a lot. And overall, I think the session was really interesting in telling us about how basically we interact with these technologies and how they could be designed to be more palatable to humans and increase the productiveness of our collaboration. So thank you very much. I would like to also invite you to the next session, which is not on Thanksgiving. So we are skipping the Thanksgiving. Everybody can have a break. And then we have a really nice session on December 1st with Barbara Mellers and our own Bob Goldstone. And then we have a couple more sessions, and then we are almost done. On December 15th, we will have a final open discussion. So stay tuned. Come again and have a nice Thanksgiving holiday. And thank you, Cindy, again.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.